and I am going to talk a little bit about the problem with the qualia debate in a second.
Please do.
But another thing that you could point out is also that when you say experience, you could have something like a thin or a thick notion. I'm not sure whether that's actually the best way to explain that, but Immanuel Kant, for example, in the Prolegomena, which is the book that he wrote after his first critique turned out to be too difficult to read for most people, he wrote the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, very explicitly as an attempt to say the same stuff, but in a way that people can understand, which is why that's the main Kant book that I've actually read every word of. And he says that what it means to have an experience is to bring intuitions under a concept. And the way that you do that is to that is a judgment. So you have an experience by making a judgment that brings intuitions under a concept. And depending on what you think a concept is, this is a relatively demanding notion of experience, right? This means that in order to have an experience, you have to do something. And it also involves a concept. I don't think about subjective experience in this way. And it's possible that what I mean by subjective experience is closer to what Kant would call just the intuitions. Of course, Kant says that, well, I'm going to get this one wrong. It's going to be embarrassing, but intuitions without concepts are blind, and concepts without intuitions are empty. I think that's maybe what he says. So the problem is he thinks that you can't really think unless you have both intuitions, which is like something that comes from the outside and impinges on your senses in some way, and concepts that allow you to experience those inputs as structured in a meaningful way. And I'm not disagreeing with that in general. I just don't think that that's how we use the term experience when we try to talk about subjective experience as a philosophical problem. Sometimes people will also say consciousness or conscious experience. The problem with consciousness as a concept is that it can also involve more higher level intellectual capacities for reflection and planning and whatever. And I'm not interested in those. I'm interested in something very close to what people mean when they say qualia. Okay, when they say qualia, they would say, for example, a singular quale might be the redness that I see when I look at this. And one thing that happens when you talk about subjective experiences that people tell you to read Daniel Dennett's Quining Qualia. It's a paper, very famous, and I think that's in general a good idea. Everyone should do that. I've done it probably 5 times because once a year, every year, while I was in grad school, I would talk about subjective experience on Twitter in some way. Back when philosophy Twitter was a pretty interesting and volatile place. But also famous philosophers like Keith Frankish, for example, would be super generous and very engaged with random, anonymous nobodies like me in good faith and talk about philosophy, which is amazing. And then they tell me to read Quining Qualia. So those are the 2 things that happen to me when I talk about subjective experience. A, someone calls me a Cartesian, and then also they tell me to read Quining Qualia, and I do. And it's always more confusing than the last time because I don't see any good arguments in the paper for thinking that subjective experience doesn't exist. And okay, now this is already a problem because Dennett later clarified in an exchange with David Papineau, an email exchange that was published or something like that, that he doesn't deny that subjective experience exists. He just thinks that qualia are a theorist's illusion or something like that. So there's something wrong with the concept of qualia as a technical term. However, I think when you actually read Quining Qualia, the article, it's pretty obvious that he means not just the technical term in some specific construal, but he does actually deny that subjective experience exists. I can try to pull up the article and read it, but if someone has the PDF, then they can look for the section where he says, he talks about what other people mean by qualia. He doesn't really give a full definition, but he says, if you believe any of those things, then you believe in what I mean by qualia. There's a phrase that is like that.
I'll find the excerpt and I'll put an overlay. It's all good when I'm editing
think,
this.
so
Useful.
what he does in the paper in general is that he presents what he calls intuition pumps. He says, I'm not going to argue that there is no subjective experience or that there aren't any qualia. I'm just going to present a bunch of scenarios that are supposed to pump our intuition. So they're supposed to get our brains jogging in a way that will make us more likely to travel towards his view, and where we believe, oh, maybe qualia actually is not a useful word at all for talking about the mind, and we should just drop that. But one of his examples, it's intuition pump number two, is the wine testing machine. He says, imagine you had a machine and you can pour a glass of wine into the
Famous
machine.
example.
The machine prints out a piece of paper that describes, oh, the smell and the taste of the wine, how it lingers on your palate or whatever. And this is indistinguishable from what a professional wine taster would say. And then he says, if you think that there's any difference between what the machine does and what the wine tester does, then you believe in qualia in the way that he thinks is objectionable or philosophically untenable. And it's completely bizarre to me how anyone could think that the machine is doing the same thing as a human tasting the wine. Like, I think that's a great way to describe what subjective experience is, because subjective experience is not pouring the wine into an opening that happens to be my mouth. Subjective experience is not when I say the words, oh, this is corky or whatever. Subjective experience is what it tastes like when I drink the wine, and it doesn't taste like anything to a machine. Um,
Well, yes, I mean it's as simple as saying if let's say you read the output by an AI agent on a wine tasting, you aren't gonna taste wine by doing that. It's like I know I mean this is Dennis's wine tasting thing is like his famous example. And frankly, before I read some of it, I thought people were kind of caricaturing Dennett's position and kind of like almost, using it to kind of attack him. But then he kind of does say essentially that, yeah, it's an illusion, the experience. What's the truth is in how you can philosophically, let's say, articulate what wine tastes like, which of course to any almost like in a colloquial sense or to any like general lay audience, that sounds absurd because in fact, one way you'd say is that what's first in like a phenomenological sense is the experience before you
yes.
even try to articulate it in like a formal sense or like using language.
Okay, so I think one thing that might be interesting here as well is to say, like when Dennett published the paper, our imagination of a wine tasting machine is probably something where it's more obvious that it doesn't have experience. Nowadays, if because of the progress of AI, if you think about maybe not ChatGPT, but like whatever we have in 20 years down the line, um, to some people, it's not like people actually ask questions about whether large language models have mental properties, right? So can ask whether ChatGPT actually has beliefs about anything, or whether LLMs can have intuitions and things like that. And I think it's important to point out that even though I think the wine tasting machine, as described by Dennett, like we have no reason to think that it would have subjective experience, um, it's possible for me to imagine a robot that has subjective experience. But there's an important difference. Like it's important to note that I think it's possible to imagine that, and it's possible for me to understand the difference between a machine that has experience and a machine that doesn't have experience. But I don't think that there's actually any empirical method for finding out whether the machine has experience or not. And I don't mean this in the terms of the current science that we have. I've never even heard a description of an experiment that would allow you to tell whether a machine has experience or not. And we can contrast this again to the whole rest of the mind. So if you think about moral judgment, um, imagine it's the middle of the 20th century, we are philosophers of mind, and one of us thinks that moral judgment is primarily a rational activity. You have concepts, you have beliefs about morality, and then you judge rationally whether something's good or bad. And the other person thinks, no, it's actually very emotional, and it's more about like some scenario makes you feel good or bad, and then that motivates a judgment. Now, I can imagine an experiment where you put people in a scanner, and then we have to assume for a moment that we believe that like certain mental processes are easily localized in the brain, and that's a very contentious issue. And I'm generally on the side of people who criticize the localization paradigm in general. But let's just assume that that was a thing. So we are trying to imagine a science like we can even being able to imagine a scientific experiment that can make this distinction is something that I think we can't do for subjective experience. So let's do the one for moral judgment, right? We imagine that we know that rational thought is maybe located in the prefrontal cortex or whatever, and emotions are maybe located somewhere else. We have strong scientific evidence and all kinds of other research that suggests that when we are emotional, when we exercise our emotional capacities, there's a certain area of the brain that has lots of blood flowing through it. That's what we actually, what we measure. And when we think rationally, the blood goes to the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is like a cartoon description, obviously, but we could put people in the scanner and then we could ask them to make moral judgments. And it's possible for us to imagine that the data would show us one side is right and the other is wrong, right? It would show us there's very little activation in the part of the brain associated with emotions and a lot in the part that's associated with rationality, or the reverse. So I can describe to you what it would look like to have empirical neuroscientific evidence for a hypothesis about moral judgment and against another, but I can't come up with an experiment that would allow me to adjudicate between, for example, different theories about the metaphysics of mind when you're like an eliminative materialist. So you think that there are only brain processes and there aren't any mental properties over and above those. The interesting thing, and I think maybe this is why I don't really fit into the debate very comfortably, is that I'm willing to give up everything except subjective experience. So if you ask about free will, for example, I'm willing to say that, like, in the sense that we talk about the world as existing objectively and publicly available to scientific investigation, maybe free will doesn't exist. There's just stuff that happens in the brain. The only part about the mind that even conceptually I cannot understand how we could tell a story about that being physical is subjective experience. And
Yeah.
I
And
think there are like heterodox versions of, for example, physicalism, where people just imagine that physics is something completely different from what it is now. Sure, if you can be a materialist if you have an asterisk, and by material you mean something completely different from everyone else, sure, then you can make everything work. But beyond that, I don't think that there is I don't well, I can't imagine an experiment that would allow us to actually, for example, show whether a sufficiently advanced AI has subjective experience or not. And I also think that the way that um, there are people in philosophy of mind who have done great work showing how neuroscience is relevant to philosophy and vice versa. And I think all of that's great. I'm super into that. But I think that they also sometimes pretend that the advances of neuroscience count as evidence for specific metaphysical views, like materialism, for example, and they don't. With the asterisk that they like that might be ammunition against someone who is like a dualist about moral judgment and thinks moral judgment is something that is not physical but happens in your mind, and or something like that. I mean, there are some, but if you think about subjective experience, nothing that neuroscience has shown it, it doesn't exert any force on the scales of metaphysical commitments at all. And the materialists in philosophy of mind believe essentially the same things that French materialists in the 17th century also believed, and they didn't have neuroscience. So like it just does not fall out of empirical scientific results.